This is Jewish Spotlight, a weekly television program presented by Chabad Lubavitch of Long Island, featuring various aspects of modern Jewish life and Jewish culture. Now, here is your host, Rabbi Tuvia Teldin.
Shalom. Today we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic in Jewish custom, a custom that, unfortunately, in life we all have to deal with, as much as we'd rather not. But there are many Jewish laws concerning what do we do in the case of death. Now, whether it be a dearly beloved one, whether it be somebody that we happen to know that we can offer some help with, very often people have questions as to what does Judaism say? What's the right thing to do now? Because we're often not prepared for the moment of death and we don't know the right thing to do. And as usual in Jewish Spotlight, we like to make sure that every Jew should be as educated as possible in all aspects of what it means to be a Jew. So this is a very important part of being an educated consumer. What I want to do is introduce a very special rabbi, a rabbi who's dedicated his life to teaching the laws and practicing the customs and helping thousands upon thousands of families throughout the metropolitan area and really throughout the world, as we'll soon find out, with the proper observance of the very holy and special customs concerning burial of a Jewish person. Rabbi Elchanan Zon, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Rabbi Zon is the administrator or the chief
Director.
rabbi of for the Vad of Queens, the special rabbinical alliance in Queens, dealing specially with the Jewish Burial Society. Rabbi Zon, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here.
Let me ask you, first of all, what is the history a little bit of the Jewish burial societies? There are many societies all over the world. Every community really should have its own society, or at least some society that can take care of its needs. Can you tell us a little bit about the background of this institution?
Sure. The Jewish Burial Society actually exists as long as Jewish communities have existed. The earliest reference to such a society is actually in the Mishnah, which was the first codification of Jewish law. And it describes Jerusalem about 2,000 years ago.
Really?
And it says that in Jerusalem, in Yerushalayim, there were chaburos, there were groups of people that took care of all aspects of the mourning process, dealing with the mourners themselves as well as taking care of the dead. And this has been an integral part of every Jewish community. In fact, almost any other group within a Jewish community is not absolutely necessary when the community forms. But a Chevra Kadisha, the Jewish Burial Society, or the Sacred Society, which is the literal translation of the words, is a group that must be there immediately, simply because we never know when someone's going to die.
Right. So you're really on call 24/6.
24/6 is about right. Occasionally someone will walk over to my home or to the shul where I pray, to the synagogue that I pray, and then ask a question about what can be done on the Sabbath. But generally it's 24/6.
Interesting. Can I ask you a personal question?
Sure.
How did you get drawn into this type of work? What brought you to dedicate your life to this kind of work? Because for many people, it's not exactly something they would jump to do, and I'm just interested in what brought you to it.
Drawn in is a good way of putting it. I didn't actually go to school and prepare for this as a profession. It wasn't something I ever intended to do. I intended to be a rabbi or an educator. It just was something that I happened to get involved with. It's rather interesting. There's a little story involved. I happened to have been at the yeshiva, the school that I studied at a time the night before the actual sessions began. There was no one in the school. Very few of us were there. And one of the teachers passed away. And there was a need for someone to stay with the body overnight, and I was chosen. And so I was asked to stay with this man from 3 in the morning till 7. And the Chevra Kadisha, the group providing the preparation of the remains, actually came in at about 7 in the morning to do the work. And at that point, I was going to leave. And one of the rabbis in the school said, "Why don't you stay? It's a great experience. You never know when you'll be out in some community and there'll be a need to do this." So I stayed. And about 3 years later, the Vad Rabbanim of Queens, the Rabbinical Council of Queens, was looking to start a community group like this in the Queens area. And they needed people who were qualified. So they came to me. I was still a teenager. And for the first 10 years or so, I was actually just one of the group of people that was doing this work. When there was a change in the administration in 1981, I offered to take the job as director for 1 year. And when I got into it, I realized that it was an area that in this country really needed a great deal of expertise.
The lack of education about what the facts are is incredible. But one thing I just want to add on also, which our audience would be curious to find out, is that we know that this is one mitzvah, one commandment, one good deed from the Torah that is considered to be perhaps the most selfless act that we can possibly do. In fact, it's given the term of being the true kindness. Why? Because sometimes we do a kindness for somebody where that kindness is done for the sake of some type of ulterior motive. In this case, though, there's no ulterior motive. You're doing it purely out of the goodness of your heart in order to be able to help that person have the proper send-off in order to go on to the next world and have the proper receiving line in the next world. So getting back to something you mentioned also about the preparation of the body. Now, let's go into that. What exactly happens? The person passes away, and we treat that body with great respect. If a person is in a hospital room at the time of death, what should they do at that time?
Well, the first thing you would want to make sure is that, if possible, it is considered great respect to have the person handled by members of his own faith or her own faith. You would want to save blood that is with the person.
So
any tubes that are removed, you would try, if it has blood, to send that along with the person.
If any bleeding, whatever,
if there was
save the sheets.
Correct. Whatever blood is the fluid that we are concerned with, we would obviously try to minimize any bleeding, but if there was any bleeding, we would try to save the blood.
And this would also be the reason why in all of the news coverage that we see in Israel,
exactly,
the same burial societies come to the terrorist sites where the suicide bombings have taken place. And what are they doing at that time? Can you explain to our audience?
Well, they're gathering. They're basically gathering every speck of flesh and every drop of blood that they possibly can for the purpose of burial. It is considered a requirement that all of the person be buried.
Okay.
And so they're actually looking to pick up every speck of blood rather than just wash it away and take care of it hygienically. Right. They're actually concerned with the respect given each individual.
So the person in normal circumstances is in a bed, and they are brought from that point. What happens to the body once you collect all the different things?
We would generally try to move the person from the bed directly to a funeral home if possible. There would be someone staying with
that's what you did as a teenager.
That's what I did. It's called a shomer,
a guardian
or a watcher.
Who usually says psalms or says special prayers by the side of the body, which is a sign of respect for the body. We don't just leave the body in the refrigerator to
Exactly, but it goes beyond that, Rabbi Teldon. I would like to focus on one very important concept which underlies a lot of the traditions that we observe, and that is our belief that the Neshamah, the soul, when a person dies, doesn't just immediately disappear and go to heaven, but that actually upon death the soul is there and is very much aware of what is happening with the body until the burial takes place. So that the way in which we treat the person is really something that the soul perceives and feels on a spiritual level, obviously, because it's a spiritual being, but it's something that's very meaningful. And so it's not just respect that we give to a person, to a body, because it once contained that soul, but actually the belief is that the soul is still there. And very often when I speak to people who are going to be involved in this type of work, I try to tell them that think of this not as a body, but as a person, because the fact is the essence, the awareness of that person is still there. And so it's really the person that we're giving respect to. And it's a time of great stress for the soul. That's one of the reasons why we prefer to bury immediately. It's obviously also required by Torah law, by biblical law, but it's also the understanding that for the soul, this is a state of kind of limbo. It's a kind of in-between state where they cannot yet fully reach the level of comfort and their final rest.
Right. Based on what you said also, it's very important when you're in the presence of the person, from the time that body has died, to be very careful about what's spoken in the room, to only speak words of praise of the person, not to talk about the person in any negative way whatsoever, and hopefully only say things that have to do with mitzvot or the good deeds of that person's past, or perhaps good deeds that will be done in the future in their honor and their memory.
That's correct. It's also, even mundane discussion is incorrect. We also don't do anything that's pleasurable in a mundane material sense. We don't eat or drink.
Right.
We don't smoke. We would not indulge in just everyday discussion.
Right.
We would talk about things that had to be done for the person.
And at the time of death itself, it's traditional as well to say some prayers, I understand.
Right, and that too is based on the same concept. One of the things we say when we watch the body is Psalms. And Psalms was written by King David, and he himself had a very turbulent, very difficult life. And this was his way of expressing his faith. The expression of those passages give comfort and a sense of solace to the soul at that time. So it's watching the person, letting the soul know that we haven't just left, and also giving them that comfort through the recitation of Psalms.
Now, the body is being watched, and then we do the tarda. We do the process of purifying the body. Can you describe for audience what is that process about? Okay,
it's a very simple, basic washing and dressing of the person without anything unnatural. It's done only naturally. There is no embalming process, which is prevalent in our world, which requires the removing of fluids and replacing with formaldehyde, which allows the body to become more lifelike and also will maintain it for a long, preserve it for a long period of time.
That's not Jewish custom.
We don't do that,
right.
But the person is washed very carefully. It is done by men for men, by women for women, so that there's a great deal of modesty and dignity and respect that is afforded. It is generally a group of 4 or 5 people that do this, so that the person is handled with great care. It's a work of love for the people who do it, and respect. And it's really a washing and dressing. There is a process of purification where water is poured over the body, or the body is immersed in a mikveh, which is a ritual bath. And then the body is dried and dressed in shrouds. The shrouds is something that, again, we've been doing for thousands of years. It's something that is done equally for all people.
Right, so no matter rich or poor, everybody ends up the same place.
Everyone ends up the same way. It's simple, but it has a great deal of meaning. Many people don't realize that shrouds are actually a full set of clothes. It contains a hat, a shirt, pants, a jacket, a belt, and then finally a sheet that wraps the body. For a man, there's also a talit, which is worn, a prayer shawl. And this is actually modeled after what the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, wore when he did the service on Yom Kippur, on the holiest day of the year, when he went into the service in the Holy Temple and stood before God and prayed for himself, for his family, and for all the Jewish people. Our belief is that when a person dies, they are going to appear before God for their final day of judgment, and they are going to pray for themselves and for their family.
So, what do you
say this is the most appropriate dress. And,
is that what you explain to somebody who says that Uncle Charlie just wanted to be buried in his Brook Brothers suit, and this is the most important thing to him, and it's in his will, and what should we do, Rabbi?
I'll tell you a quick story. I remember a man who died, and I called his wife to find out his Jewish name, and she told me that, which is one of the things we refer to them by when they pass on. And she told me that he was a great tzaddik. He was a very righteous man. When I got to the funeral home, I was told that, in fact, they were going to put clothing on him, which kind of negates what the tahara process really is all about. I couldn't understand why. And I called this woman back, and when I asked her what happened, she said, she actually started crying. She said it was her daughter who absolutely insisted that while they were going to put on shrouds, they were going to put clothing over the shrouds. I said to her, why? Your father was obviously a very observant man, a very righteous man. Why would you want to do this? And she said, you didn't know my father. My father was the nattiest dresser there ever was, and every night he would spend a great deal of time setting out his clothing and making sure that everything matched. He only wore things that were designer clothes and silk shirts, and clothing was very important to him. And I said, I understand, but let me ask you, what did he wear when he went to bed? She says, well, he wore silk pajamas. I said, what did he wear when he went swimming? He He says, well, he wore designer trunks. I said, well, why didn't he wear the suit that you brought to the funeral home when he went to sleep, if that was his favorite suit? And she said, Rabbi, you're making fun of me. It's inappropriate. I said, well, why don't you think about what is appropriate for this occasion? I said, for us, with our understanding of what the shrouds really are meant to symbolize,
That is the most
there
appropriate
is
dress.
nothing more appropriate. And so I told her, in fact, interestingly, the shrouds come in muslin or cotton, and also in linen. And linen is really the more traditional
Right.
form, because that's what the high priest wore. He wore linen. I said, because your father's being dressed in a suit at your request, they actually are going to be dressing him in muslin shrouds, which is the kind of shrouds your father would never want because he was so meticulous about his clothes. I said, so there's really a contradiction. And the fact was, she started crying and she got very emotional. She said, forget the clothing, we'll leave him in the shrouds. And so it really was, so appropriate is very important. Appropriate.
Very
The
good.
fact is, we all get dressed the same way,
Right.
and that's
Okay,
extremely
now
meaningful.
let's go on to the next step. So we have a lot of ground to cover in order to be able to, no pun intended.
okay.
Okay. After the Torah is completed, we have the funeral service, the shomer stays, the guardian stays, and he's saying prayers literally right up until the service itself. We have a funeral service, whether it be in the synagogue or be at the funeral home. After that, the progression begins, and we go to the cemetery. Now, the cemetery is also a very important part where the many different laws have to be observed. For instance, let's say the casket. Can you describe for us what is the Jewish requirement as far as a casket is concerned?
The casket should be made of wood. Traditionally, people use very simple caskets that are simple pine caskets, but anything that is made of wood is technically traditional. It also should have holes at the bottom of the casket if possible. The reason for that is so that the body will return to its natural place, to the earth, as quickly as possible. And in Israel today, we don't bury in caskets. We actually bury directly in the ground. There are cinder blocks that are placed around the body and a piece of wood on top, but the body actually lies wrapped in a sheet or in a talit for a man. In many parts of Israel, they actually don't even use the talit, but it is placed in the ground and directly, and this was the custom in Europe as well in many places. So since we do use a casket, that is our tradition as is required by our law, nevertheless we make the holes in the bottom to create a connection between the person and the earth itself. We also place earth from Israel in the coffin with the body for the purpose of, since it's a great honor to be buried in Israel, and since we don't bury in Israel in many instances, we at least place some earth from Israel with the remains to give them that honor. I remember one funeral director saying to me, Rabbi, no wonder Israel's such a small country. They've been exporting it all these years to place in caskets. But
very nice. Now, when you have your burial ceremony is going on, Stimus HaKever, the covering of the body or the casket itself. Very often I've seen in some ceremonies, unfortunately, the casket is left almost suspended in air. Or perhaps it's dropped, it's put down onto the bottom, and a couple of shovel loads are put on, and then the service is over and everybody walks away. Explain to us the importance of bringing that process to its full completion.
okay. First of all, the biblical requirement is for burial, and burial means in the earth, covered by the earth. So we're actually performing that mitzvah, we're performing that commandment. But it's also a mark of respect. I remember officiating at a funeral as a rabbi, where there were members of the family who were accustomed to leaving before the actual complete filling of the grave took place. And one of the people there was very distraught over the sound of the earth hitting the casket.
I've had the same experience many times.
And I remember him expressing a great deal of, he got quite indignant and said, you know,
Why do we
aren't
have
you
to
a
do
bit
this?
insensitive? And I stopped the service right there, and I explained that, first of all, if he wanted to leave, that would be perfectly all right, and he could wait in his car and then come back when we were finished if it was uncomfortable for him. But I just explained to him that for us, there is no greater mitzvah than providing this honor for this person. This is actually the last act of kindness that we will ever be able to do for them. And so for it to be done by us is really a great honor and a great mark of respect for them.
And I tell people also, I say that as opposed to having a tractor do it, or as opposed to having the cemetery diggers do it, here every person who's putting every drop of dirt on that casket is doing it with love, with respect, is doing it as an act of honor, and like you say, it's the last possible act that we can do in this world for this individual.
It's very interesting because you're touching on something a point that I really like to focus on just for a moment. There's a very basic difference in perception between the Jewish view of death and funerals as to the secular view. And you'll very often hear funeral directors make a statement that funerals are for the living, that it's really the concern is with the mourners. And the Jewish view is really very reversed. While there's a tremendous emphasis on the needs and a sensitivity to the feelings of the mourners, which is really very clearly defined by the Shiva process and the amount of time that is given and the love that is shown by everyone. Nevertheless, until the burial takes place, the focus of the funeral is to create the greatest respect and provide the greatest comfort for the Neshamah, for the soul, and for our loved one.
For their journey.
And it's really based on that understanding that it is still a person and there is still a need to provide for their love and their respect and their comfort.
Very good point. Very good point. Now I want to get to a couple of things. You had mentioned before about the soul still being connected to the body. At what point does the soul, we believe, begin to take its journey and take leave of the body and start to work on its ascent?
I don't know at which point it begins, but certainly the very main part of that ascent takes place at the time that the burial is
so
completed.
burial will be the time, and then the body is at rest. We fulfilled our obligation, and the soul can begin its journey and leave the body, knowing that the body is in its proper place.
And there is, by the way, still the soul, by the way, is not a necessarily one essential unit.
We think of it as an entity.
We think of it as an entity that kind of, it's either here or there. There's actually a presence of the soul at the grave, and it departs in stages. And that stages can be at the end of the Shiva period, the 7-day period, the 30-day period, the year, and even each yahrzeit we go back to graves. And this is why we go back, exactly. When the body is finally decomposed, that's another process of ascent. And it's a process. It takes time, okay? And so it's one of the reasons for many of the customs that we observe is really based on that understanding. So it's not just one unit.
I want to touch on a couple of issues quickly because we're running out of time, but common misconceptions. Tell us the Jewish view on autopsy.
Well, because burial is a biblical requirement, number one, there is a requirement to bury the entire person. When an autopsy is performed, very often, large portions of the remains, whether it's tissue or body fluids or even pieces of organs that are discarded or even taken for study, but very often just washed away in the process. So that's one issue. There's also the idea of desecrating the body unnecessarily, particularly with our understanding that the Neshamah, the soul, is still there and focused on the body. It is extremely painful for the soul to observe its own body being desecrated in this way. So there's a biblical requirement for complete burial. There is a very strong emphasis on not desecrating the body in any way, which is why we show it so much respect. And this is obviously a gross change in that perception and that need.
Okay.
So that's why, and by the way, where autopsies need to be done, where they're federally mandated and required, we obviously can't stop it, but there are many things that can be done that to minimize the desecration and give it as much respect as possible.
Fine. Now, many people don't understand. I hear all types of questions asked about if I have a tattoo, I'm not allowed to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. Can you explain the view on that? It's
very interesting. I don't know the source for it, and I hate to create, somehow knock down one of the most famous misconceptions. Again, there may be something somewhere that I'm not familiar with. It might just very well be there were instances where certain people who exhibited very clear non-observance of very basic Jewish law, that were not permitted burial in Jewish cemeteries, or at least they were buried in separate areas of Jewish cemeteries. At some time, people who committed suicide were in that category because it was done out of a lack of belief in God and so on and so forth.
A person who converted
out of the faith and so on and so forth. So someone who this is the only explanation that I've ever heard, is the fact that since a tattoo is so obvious and it's right out there, and it is something that cannot be changed. So for someone to inflict that upon themselves and to have such a obvious lack of concern for a Torah law, for a biblical law, that would put them outside. But the fact is that
it's not done.
The fact is it is not done,
so
and
many
people today
people
with tattoos are buried in Jewish
Right, and
cemeteries.
so many people who have tattoos don't even know that it's against Jewish law.
Right, but I wouldn't encourage anyone Jewish to have a tattoo done. It is something that is a flagrant violation of Jewish law, but nevertheless, for those of you who may already have it, I wouldn't be concerned that I could not be buried in a Jewish cemetery, because it can be done.
Okay, so people, because I know many people are very, very nervous about
That's,
that. One other issue, we're talking to Rabbi Zon, who's the director of the VAD, the Chevra Kedisha Jewish Burial Society of Queens. Rabbi Zon, very, very important topic I'd like you to deal with. The topic of cremation. I think there's a tremendous amount of misconception as to what the Jewish view is on cremation, and many people feel that it's the easiest way and can just avoid the costs of a burial, or what difference does it make after I'm dead, whether or not my body is going to be buried or not. Please elucidate why it is so important, not just in Jewish law, but for common decency and for the importance of a person's future, the future of their soul, why they need to be buried.
Okay. First of all, again, the basic biblical requirement is for burial. Most of everything else we do, including the tahara, the washing, the preparation of the shrouds, is really of rabbinic origin. The biblical law requires burial. And the fact is, if we believe in God and creation, and that God created man, God also mandated how we are to dispose of ourselves. Our bodies are not something that we own and really are for us to do with as we choose. We can't do that in life, and we can't do it in death. And the fact is that burial is a requirement. We're all familiar with God's statement to Adam, dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. And so it's very clear that if we believe in a God who created us, that he told us how to dispose of ourselves after 120 years on this earth, or as long as we're given. And so it's seen as a very basic denial of that, of God's creation. So that's one thing. The other thing is, we're all familiar with Ecclesiastes that says the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. It's a two-step process. The dust has to return to the earth and go through the process, which is part of the atonement process, and then the spirit can return to God who gave it. So it actually,
it's a natural process.
It's a natural process.
We're born, and we have to return, and we recycle our body and feed it back to Mother Earth in a certain way, if you can use that term, in order to be able to continue the cycle. Rabbi Zon, can you give your phone number to our audience, so if they have any questions or would like to get literature? We have literature here from the VAD of Queens that we'd be happy to send out. 718-849-9700. 849-9700.
That's correct.
Okay. Anybody who is interested can, of course, check in and call Rabbi Zon. I want to thank you very much, Rabbi Zon, for your time. It's very much appreciated. And please think about what we're talking about here. There are many implications as far as how this affects you and your family. Be a big mitzvah to be able to do something along the lines of what Rabbi Zon said. Take care. We'll see you next week.